I want to talk about Peter Sotos. I want to talk about a lot of other books too, and I will, but talking about Sotos is one of the main motivations I have to talk about books at all. But maybe I should narrow it down. I want to talk about Sotos' work. Plenty of people want to talk about Sotos, to inject their 2 cents, to shake their heads disapprovingly, to position themselves on a moral high ground, but very few want to discuss his work in and of itself, the nuts and bolts and the content between the covers. I have only a little interest in Sotos the man. Certainly there's no way to fully divorce the man from his writing, given how intensely personal much of it is, but I have tremendous interest in his writing. And given how imbalanced the ratio of discussion is between author and text, I'd prefer to expand upon the latter. And given how much of the writing that does exist about the text seems more interested in flattering itself and the reader for being so bold as to interact with such transgressive literature, I think some more concrete analysis is in order. Okay, so how do I even begin to describe why most analysis of Sotos is a failure? Why nearly every critical effort ends up being trivial, if not flat out wrong? It's largely a matter of scope and density. Sotos books aren't puzzle boxes exactly. There's not a specific solution to them, but there are certainly distinct ideas that the author is attempting to get across, but many of them are abstract and frustratingly difficult to communicate in words alone. The intense, confrontational, and explicit nature of Sotos' writing is, to him, inherently necessary for the meaning of his work to be conveyed. We're not operating purely in realms of knowledge here. While Sotos works almost entirely within the realm of the material world, all these words and pictures and juxtapositions of different facts and framings of reality are supposed to add up to something more, and that something isn't a thing that can be neatly framed in a sentence. It involves sensation, personal involvement, personal complicity. While most critique of Sotos is excessively emotional and personal, some measure of those things is, in fact, necessary to understand it. So already we run into a problem within a problem. The first outer problem is that most of the material available about Sotos is by alt-culture looky-loos who are, to say the least, unprepared for what he has to offer. Sotos' involvement with White House exposed him to a much wider audience than he would typically reach, to the point where he is often understood as a former member of White House first and a writer second, when the opposite is far more accurate. So when your average noise dork who likes White House but probably nervously wrings their hands about their more problematic aspects finally lays their eyes on some unexpurgated Sotos text, they immediately lose their fucking minds and get pulled in one of 2 directions. The first is complete disavowal and dismissal. Sotos is just the most evil man to ever exist. Fans of his work are evil people. The writing has no redeeming value and should be ignored, if not outright banned. The other direction, which is somehow even more incorrect, is redemptive, slotting Sotos alongside various true crime charlatans under the guise of raising awareness or investigating the darkest parts of humanity or whatever moralistic horseshit they need to believe in order to feel better about their own interests. Or, worse still, that it's some plea for understanding and compassion by a hurt and lonely man. It's a cope. Unsavory material creating excuses for its own existence, excuses that its fans immediately seize on to, is an almost inherent feature in modern culture. Be it a porn star talking about the feminist empowerment of getting pissed on, or the horror movie director rambling about exploring trauma, there's always a reason for something to be other than what it is. Okay, so no normies allowed, got it, but then you run the risk of moving too far in the other direction, getting bloodlessly analytical about it, not getting personally involved, seeing the work as words on a page and nothing more. That's wrong too. You have to be personally involved in order to take anything meaningful away from Sotos. This is difficult for me. I'm a pretty jaded guy even when it comes to content as extreme as this, and my prurient interests and Sotos's are largely pretty different. If you're not present for it, reading his stuff can frequently turn into skimming it, owing to his penchant for repetition and looping structural ideas, but this would be a big mistake. Rarely does Sotos ever repeat something just for the sake of it. And if you don't bother to interrogate the structural weirdness that permeates most of his writing, you'll be missing a lot. Hell, in some of his later books, you'll be missing pretty much the entire thing, as they frequently get so confusing and rambling and incoherent that huge swaths of text will need to be decoded in some sense before any real meaning can be extracted from it. But you can't look that closely either. Some of the writing is meant to be concretely understood, and some of it is meant to be felt, and this can change from sentence to sentence, even mid-sentence, and Sotos certainly isn't helpfully color-coding which material is which, so it falls upon the reader to trial and error their way into some form of understanding, which will almost certainly be wrong. It's a mostly thankless task, and the reward for diving so deeply into it is, by my estimation, some of the worst conclusions about humanity imaginable. I've had to rework this script a lot more than I usually do. The issue isn't the content, but how to impart meaning in the right way. Sotos is an author whose work evolves considerably throughout his career, and each work in at least some way builds off the work before. His writing and his worldview must be tackled in layers. The original version of this script jumped too far forward. Too much context from later work invaded it, confusing things considerably. Sotos is not a writer who can be easily summarized, and attempting to do so without working through individual layers of meaning and understanding can lead one astray. I'll almost certainly screw up here and there, and it's a difficult task to talk about any of his work in a complete vacuum given their interrelation, but I'll do my best. The important thing to remember is that various lines of inquiry will be opened up over the course of this series, and it takes time for them to develop. So if it seems like there's something very obvious that I'm leaving on the table without addressing, there's probably a reason for it. Most likely that it'll be tackled in a later episode when the opportunity presents itself. For now, though, let's start at what is, as far as I can tell, the most foundational layer. First, a reading from Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-5. Weary had a block of balsa wood which was supposed to be a foxhole pillow. He had a prophylactic kit containing 2 tough condoms for the prevention of disease only. He had a whistle he wasn't going to show anybody until he got promoted to corporal. He had a dirty picture of a woman attempting sexual intercourse with a Shetland pony. He had made Billy Pilgrim admire that picture several times. The woman and the pony were posed before velvet draperies which were fringed with deedly balls. They were flanked by Doric columns. In front of one column was a potted palm. The picture that Weary had was a print of the first dirty photograph in history. The word photography was first used in 1839, and it was in that year, too, that Louis J.M. Daguerre revealed to the French Academy that an image formed on a silvered metal plate covered with a thin film of silver iodide could be developed in the presence of mercury vapor. In 1841, only 2 years later, an assistant to Daguerre, André Lefebvre, was arrested in the Tuileries Gardens for attempting to sell a gentleman a picture of the woman and the pony. That was where Weary bought his picture, too, in the Tuileries. Lefebvre argued that the picture was fine art, and that his intention was to make Greek mythology come alive. He said the columns and the potted palm proved that. As long as transgressive media has existed, it has felt the need to justify itself. This usually takes the form of some deeply hidden morality tale or parable tucked within it. This tendency is so complete and all-consuming that it's difficult to even imagine any other way of seeing it. Regardless of whether or not the intent existed in the first place, these things are always reflexively assumed to have some deeper meaning, some twist to them that makes them provocative but ultimately socially acceptable. The people who make these sorts of things, too, play into this, allowing pseudo-intellectuals to make excuses for them. A bold, antisocial statement willingly brought to heel for any number of reasons. Fear, a desire for acceptance, a wider audience. D. Snyder's grandstanding for the PMRC replicated endlessly. See, guys? I'm just like you after all. Willfully undercutting their own work with reassurances of its harmlessness. An artist can mean whatever they want with their work, but the audience is typically there for what it looks like. We want blood. What we're expressly not here to do is to investigate and enjoy these things because we're doing a fucking public service. We're not listening to the things we listen to, watching the things we watch, or reading the things we read out of some sort of infinite humanist concern. We are not raising awareness. We are not shining a light on the darkness. We are not contributing to the betterment of humanity through consuming media about things that most of the world finds distasteful. We're doing a lot of things, probably, but foremost and universal among them is that we're satisfying a prurient urge. For whatever reason, you and me and all the other people dwelling in this little corner of the world have a particular fixation on various kinds of degeneracy and sadism and cruelty and perversion and insert negative noun here. But whenever some authority figure or loved one or person next to you on the bus catches you in the act of enjoying whatever it is you enjoy, you turn into a kid hastily clearing his browser history on the family computer in the living room. How many excuses do you have rehearsed for when the wrong person sees Blood Libel playing on your phone or a copy of Vase de Noches on your shelf? How often have you made stammering rationalizations? How do you like to divorce yourself from the content you enjoy? How do you claim that the thing you're engaged in during your spare time isn't really what you like? How often does the word interesting get used when exciting, pleasurable, or satisfying would be a better fit? True crime is unique in that it's a genre of writing where the excuses are baked into the content. As the information about the subject matter at hand grows more detailed, so do the protestations of the author. Every time you read the lurid descriptions of some vicious slaughter of the innocent, the author lurks just over your shoulder, tut-tutting, well, that's just terrible. I don't feel like the absurdity of this needs to be further explicated, but clearly it does. True crime is a completely depraved endeavor. Every rationalization about its existence is prima facie ridiculous. Raising awareness, drawing attention to abuse, exploring the dark side of humanity, all mendacious, self-serving rationalizations for rubbernecking at human carnage. As though another depiction of Dahmer drilling holes in twink skulls is some great victory for liberal values. Like every picture of Darfur genocide victims has you racing to the phone to contribute to the Christian Children's Fund. If exposure was morality, LiveLeak would be the Vatican. Do any of these lies sound familiar to you? If you're the sort of person who listens to death metal and watches horror movies, you're certainly the same sort of person who developed a school counselor and parent-concerning fascination for serial killers and medieval torture methods at a young age. How old were you when you first learned about the classics, your Bundys and Gacy's and Kempers? The first time you saw a drawing of Zodiac in his hood with the crosshair symbol, gun drawn on some unsuspecting couple, what was your first reaction? Was it along the lines of, wow, what an insight into the darkest parts of humanity? Or was it more like, man, that's fucking hard? If it was the latter, has your earnestly held opinion changed to the former? Or have you just repeated it so many times you've started to believe that's how you really feel? I'm not saying that there can never be some sort of positive impulse to this sort of thing, misguided or not, but it's always a secondary motivation. What drives anyone's interest in abjection, whatever form of it might fascinate you the most, is always inherently perverse, voyeuristic, and to a certain extent, fetishistic. If you disagree with this assessment, you can stop listening now. This is the foundational idea that my criticism and Sotos' work is based upon. Without it, nothing else functions. If you can't agree with this standpoint, you will gain nothing from reading Sotos, and I would actually say that you probably have very little to gain from any of my work as a critic for his books or for anything else. We will always be talking past each other. Take that for what you will. It follows naturally, then, that Sotos, at least in his early work, writes true crime without moral intent. This stuff up front is a big summation of Sotos as a writer and of some of the bigger ideas within his work, so different books certainly have different centers, but this is loosely how his writing could be described in a single sentence. In fact, in his earliest work, which we'll be discussing today and over a couple more episodes of this series, he reverses the polarity of true crime writing entirely. The material in Pure, his earliest extant writing, is beyond amoral. It loudly and boastfully lionizes various violent criminals, centering largely, but not exclusively, on acts of child rape and murder. Far beyond a dispassionate description of events as understood, Sotos is outright celebratory about these acts, his enthusiasm, excitement, and approval typically directly correlating with the viciousness of the acts themselves. It probably goes without saying that this presents certain problems for any sort of serious critique of his work. These problems are themselves addressed in Sotos' own fashion in some of his work, but we'll cross those bridges when we come to them. The bigger problem, as I see it, is that the extremity of the content ends up largely flattening any discussion about it into a false dichotomy of approval or disapproval. That's not a question that interests me, and it doesn't seem to be a question that interests Sotos either. Unfortunately, there's no way around it but through, either for the books or for their critical analysis. The extremity is part and parcel of what's being expressed, and if the content was toned down to reach greater understanding by a wider audience, it would be qualitatively not the same thing. If you deem the extremity unnecessary, by definition the entire endeavor is unnecessary. You cannot divorce the severity of the content from its meaning. These books are written in a certain manner and very deliberately, not merely to shock, as some have suggested, a particularly absurd suggestion given how limited the print runs are and how generally reclusive Sotos is as a person, but to elucidate certain artistic points with extremity as one of only many tools in the toolbox. But it's a very, very important tool. I'm not fond of doing this, as I think it largely insults both myself and my audience, so I'm only going to do it once for this entire series. If you have trepidation about the sort of content that these books entail, I advise you not to listen to this. To make it perfectly clear, in case you haven't been paying attention or are unfamiliar with Sotos' work, it deals largely in enthusiastic, approving, and yes, frequently eroticized depictions of child rape and murder, torture, all forms of abuse, mass murder, genocide, and likely many, many more transgressions that I'm simply forgetting at the moment, most of which involve real-life crimes and their victims. Furthermore, I will be frequently quoting directly from the books, fully unexpurgated, with the small exception of certain slurs, which I will censor simply because I believe those have the greatest potential to actually get this work removed from the platform rather than merely demonetized, the latter of which I accept. I would prefer to discuss this material without the need for any sort of modification, but I've had to strike a compromise between perfect authenticity and making what I believe to be serious critical work available to all those who are interested, and for that I apologize. And on that note, one last point before we get to the book at hand. I have little to no interest in debating these books on moral grounds, nor will my critiques of them continue on that very well-trodden path. This applies to this book, any other books by Sotos, or any other books I cover at all. I plan on this series being a place to seriously discuss very extreme works of art. If the other content on this channel has not made this clear, let me help. I am not in the business of artistic apologia. I will not preface every quote from a book or description of a scene with my disapproval. I'm starting this series with the full understanding that merely doing this will likely alienate a large part of my potential audience, and I accept this. But what I will not accept is changing my methodology to assuage the feelings of people who likely have no business being here to begin with. And with that, let's get started with the earliest available material by Peter Sotos, Total Abuse, Collected Writings, 1984 to 1995.
He made us have sex with them and with other guys, and he's done it with other people. I don't know, I just don't like him.
We found out she had been defecated on, that it was smeared all over her body and put in her mouth.
The children have to live with this for the rest of their lives. It will never be known whether or not the children were actually molested or whether they were led to believe they were molested. The parents have
Sotos
to
has
live
a
with
fairly
this, and
sprawling
there's nothing
bibliography,
that
which can take some
I
effort to
can say or
navigate.
anyone else can
There's
say
not really a
to make
clear
them feel
path
better.
through his work for
We
several
did
reasons.
the best job
One, because it's relatively inaccessible, not just due to content, but logistics. Sotos' books are typically released as very small print runs, understandable given their small audience, and they tend to fetch prices that range from expensive to more horrifying than their content on the secondary market, if you're even able to find them at all. You're very unlikely to find any of these in your local used bookstore, so acquiring them is a matter of diligent eBay sniping or just hoping some online bookseller stumbles into a copy without really knowing what they have. Ebook versions are unavailable outside of some bootleg scans of highly varying quality, which are themselves often difficult to get and usually require speaking to someone privately, and the best way to get your hands on this material is typically through private sale. One forum in particular is one of the best routes. If you know, you know, and I'd like to thank some of the people over there for their impressive depth of knowledge on Sotos, which helps fill in certain gaps about his work. I won't be citing them directly, as they certainly don't need a bunch of randos suddenly entering their space, but they'll undoubtedly listen to this, and their accidental assistance with this project is greatly appreciated. To ameliorate this issue somewhat, there will occasionally be re-releases of his books, sometimes as compilations of a few different pieces put together in a single volume. Total Abuse is the first of these, released in 1995 by Jim Goad on his Goad to Hell Enterprises imprint, which released this, the various incarnations of his Answer Me zine, and seemingly nothing else. It contains the 3 extant issues of Sotos' zine Pure, originally released in 1984, with the 3rd issue unreleased until this volume came out. It also features Tool, originally unreleased until this volume, and Parasite, a zine-cum-newsletter sort of thing that Sotos originally self-published from 1993 to 1995, though how exactly it was distributed then is something I have little to no information on. It is, as far as I can tell, the best way to read Sotos' earliest work, particularly Pure and Parasite, which I believe have not been officially re-released in any other form, though some scans are available. Now, a compromise is struck here. Pure, as replicated in this book, is lacking the picture collage content that was featured in the original zine. This is one of the other problems with getting a grasp of Sotos' bibliography. When reprinted, his work is frequently altered, with material added or subtracted, rearranged, etc. For the metalheads out there, think of it like navigating the discography of a band like Moonblood or the LLN. Merely having a copy of a particular piece doesn't necessarily mean you have all the content that's ever been associated with it. My copy, for what it's worth, is in pretty good condition. Some minor wear and tear, but highly readable, and no real damage to the pages themselves. This one was a gift probably close to a decade ago now. Here's another reason why discussion of Sotos is so limited, and when it actually exists, mostly shit. No one actually has any of the books. I would hazard a guess that at least 80% and probably more of online discussion of Sotos is exclusively based on the PDF scans of the first 2 issues of Pure that have been going around for years, if they're based on any actual reading at all. I don't have a large collection of his work. I seriously doubt that anyone save Sotos himself has everything. But anything I do discuss in this series will be related exclusively to items I have hard copies of, with notes given on what differences may exist between different versions of the same book. As a side note, I am always interested in expanding my collection, so if you have any Sotos work that you're looking to part with for a reasonable price, to someone who will read it rather than immediately resell it, please reach out and let me know. Due to the current climate of internet criticism, there's a tremendous industry of middlemen who plumb the depths of various dark, disturbing works of art and pass their findings off to normies who are too squeamish to experience the original article for themselves but still want to play around in the muck just a little bit. The problem with this is obvious. These middleman content creators function as gatekeepers for material that their audiences really have no business experiencing, and as a result, there's zero fact-checking occurring in any of these one-sided discussions. This is further distorted in Sotos' case by the inaccessibility of his material, and given that these content creators who fancy themselves amateur scholars of some sort aren't going to spend the understandably exorbitant amount of money needed to acquire ink and paper Sotos, they instead go to, you guessed it, PDF scans. And while these scans may be legitimate articles, they skew dramatically toward the earliest parts of Sotos' long and multi-phased career, causing the audiences for this sort of content to have a deeply distorted view of what the overall arc of his work entails. It's always extreme, depraved, and amoral, sure, but not always in the way you would think, and certainly not usually in the way that those who have only read a blurry scan of Pure would suggest it is. Back to total abuse. Today's episode will be focusing on Pure exclusively. I had originally planned to do all 3 segments of total abuse in a single long piece, but given the scope of this project, I thought it would be more sensible to separate it into 3 individual pieces. Furthermore, these works aren't fundamentally related, except in chronology. Pure, Tool, and Parasite are individual works with substantially different structures, purposes, and inflections, and examining them all together might have the unintended effect of suggesting they're more interrelated than they actually are. It's also just an absurd amount of content. Total Abuse is 240 oversized magazine-style pages of almost exclusively dense 2-column text, which took me about 3 weeks of nightly reading to get through on my most recent cover-to-cover adventure. Much has been said about Pure, a little less about Tool, and almost nothing about Parasite, which is a real shame as, at least in my opinion, the Parasite material is the strongest work here by a wide margin. One last note before we begin. There will be one important through line in these 3 pieces, that being the interview between Jim Goad and Peter Sotos that opens Total Abuse. Titled 120 Days of Sotos and transcribed at an unknown time, I assume sometime in 1995 given its references to Parasite, it consists of 10 pages of conversation between the pair which composes, I believe, the only material unique to Total Abuse. I take a little issue with its placement in the book. I think it would be a much bigger asset placed at the end rather than the beginning. It needs to be understood in the wake of reading the material, not as a preface to it. Without that context, or maybe with the additional context of the interview, I'm not sure any of it has quite the same effect. I also take a little issue with the interview itself. It's more a conversation between friends than an interview proper, and as such, there's a little more give and agreeability and gregariousness than I think I really want. That being said, it certainly illuminates plenty of things about the pieces found in Total Abuse and Sotos' work as a whole, and given the rarity of interviews with Sotos and his somewhat notoriously elliptical manner of speaking in most of them, it's still nice to have something a bit more direct and grounded to grab onto. I'll be quoting from it when pertinent, and if you happen to have a copy of Total Abuse, I recommend going over it again. It's not just more of the same. And now, finally, Pure. Since I plan to move chronologically through Sotos' bibliography, we'll be starting this project with Pure. This is, for better or worse, typically the first and often the only thing people read by Sotos. I would argue, though, that maybe it should be the last. It's certainly the simplest and most straightforward of his writing, but it's also in some sense some of the most challenging. Sotos' reputation for extreme content largely comes from his early material, the stuff contained in Total Abuse and a handful of books afterward. Partway through the 2000s, a significant shift occurs, and Sotos' material develops tremendously more nuance, vulnerability, and complexity, becoming in some ways more accessible despite its increased abstraction. This change in tone helps to explicate some of the deeper underpinnings of this early work, which might seem, shall we say, pointlessly antagonistic without that additional context. Thus, you can imagine starting from more recent material and winding up back here with this rough, primitive work given far more nuance by where the author would eventually go. As such, Pure's extremity, bluntness, and comparatively widespread distribution owing again to relatively easily obtainable PDF files means that it functions as a filter for his potential audience. Whether that's a good or bad thing is up to you. I merely bring it up to point out that what we explore here is certainly not the be-all, end-all of what Sotos has to offer. And that might be an opinion Sotos has as well. It's difficult to confirm, given the relative unavailability of interviews and, of those that exist, sometimes the necessity of translation, but an oft-repeated point about Sotos is that he has implied feeling a certain measure of regret or embarrassment over his early work. I doubt he's ever said that outright, given how circuitous he is in discussions of his writing, but given the direction his work would later go, it's understandable. Pure, in particular, has something of a juvenile, enfant terrible quality to it. It is, in my and many others' estimation, his weakest work. It's not without merit. Its bracing, deliberately confrontational quality has some inherent value, and there's lines of prose here and there which point to what Sotos would eventually become as an author, but it's also a little silly, repetitive, and inherently one-dimensional. Its strength is its weakness. The intensity and viciousness of the material is disorienting and eye-opening when consumed in small doses, but rapidly becomes plotting and goofy when you keep reading. The difference between potency and absurdity can be a matter of quantity alone. I've seen people talk about smashing through all the issues of Pure in one sitting. Maybe that works for some, but certainly not me. I think the ideal way to read Pure is probably to read one piece from it per day or so. They're like gourmet jelly beans, a very distinct experience one at a time, but basically an indecipherable slurry of sugar when eaten by the handful. Just to set the tone, a reading. Here's a passage from Pure issue number 1, toward the beginning of a piece titled Kitty Torture. There is an added pleasure in child torture, a pleasure that lives on even after the child lay dead and rotting. Parents. The pain of the parents allows the libertine to forever enjoy his crimes. Little kidlings are precious to parents whose lives become meaningful and important because of the little bundle of love that bounces on their knees. Their grief and sense of loss are immense when their tiny gods' gifts are destroyed. Their entire lives crumble and break. An excruciating pain that becomes omnipotent as the child's memory is rendered burdensome due to the brutality and masterful eloquence of the dominant. Every time Leslie Ann Downey's mommy remembers her little dead child, her twinkling images are quickly torn to bits by Ian Brady's ingenious tortures. She hears the screams and tastes the tears that Brady wrested from her little girl's body. She sees her daughter's 10-year-old body covered with Brady's hands and cum. She tries to block the picture from her mind but can't. It's a permanent pain that lives on, growing like a cancer with her darling daughter's memory. Perhaps a little context is necessary here. Pure is the earliest written material by Sotos which has been published. Originally written and released in 1984, its original run was just 2 issues, with a third written but unreleased after Sotos' arrest for child pornography in 1985. It's frequently written on the internet that the material in question was Pure number 2 itself, which featured a cover image taken from a child pornography magazine, but it was actually unrelated material, a magazine titled Incest number 4. Either way, while I don't think it's been stated outright, it seems safe to assume that Sotos' legal troubles led to the third planned issue being shelved, going unreleased as far as I can tell, until the release of Total Abuse in 1995. Issue number 3 is split into volumes 1 and 2. I'm not sure what the anticipated form of release was for this issue, or if there's an intended distinction between the two, but for our purposes, we'll treat it as all part of the same issue. Given that there's no substantial difference in content between it and the previous 2 issues, it just doesn't seem like an important detail. Pure is the material that best matches the simplified concept of Sotos as true crime inverted. The format of most articles is largely the same, a particularly sordid and tasteless look at one particular killer's crimes, with an emphasis on highly detailed descriptions of their murders, the suffering of the victims, and, as the previous reading touched on, a particular emphasis on the suffering of the victims' families, a primary preoccupation of Sotos's, which will be an important feature of his writing throughout his entire career. The tone is uniformly sadistic, contemptuous, and frequently eroticized, befitting Sotos's fixation on specifically sexually motivated crimes, particularly those against children. Sotos would later eschew nearly all coverage of crimes not specifically in the realm of child rape and murder, but in Pure there's a bit more variation, including seemingly non-sexually motivated murder, the satanic panic-driven McMartin preschool case, and rather infamously Nazi war crimes. Just because it's so unique to this work, let's check out a passage of content with that bent, this time from Pure number 2 in the piece entitled Klaus Barbie. Barbie survivors sing their sob stories over and over and over. Naked, humiliated, beaten, deformed Jews stomped and squashed like bugs. Minutes, hours, days, months. Screaming Jews, crippled by birth, rendered more crippled by slow, endless beatings. Tortured, burnt, drowned, shot, and thrown away. Fingers, toes, eyeballs, and nipples being chopped and pulled and hacked and gouged. Long needles pumping acid into pale, dying flesh. Longer needles pushed through rib cages and into lungs. Spines crushed and twisted. Forced submersion in freezing water. German shepherd cunt rape. Crying Jews. And Barbie laughing all the while. To my knowledge, this pro-Nazi material never comes up again in Sotos's work, thankfully for how goofy it is in spite of its extremity, and Sotos seems inclined to agree. In the interview with Goad, he mentions his lack of belief in any sort of Nazi ideology and refers to his writing in Pure as Jew-baiting, tacitly acknowledging the pugilistic, deliberately shocking quality of at least some of the material on display. Which actually brings us to a pretty interesting conversation about this material and, more broadly, Sotos's writing career at large. Over the course of this series, I'm going to bring up a lot of threads of inquiry which may or may not be answered by later books, but I think they're important to establish so there's a chain of thought to follow through the bibliography. As such, it's also necessary to keep the framing relatively constrained to individual works. I say this primarily to establish something important. When I criticize something in Sotos's work, even harshly, this does not mean that it is necessarily a recurring problem throughout other books. Sotos establishes a lot of complex individual ideas throughout his career which will wax and wane in quality and significance, so try to take my comments on just about anything as being about a particular work unless I indicate otherwise. Let's talk about what we'll call the edgelord dilemma. A pretty standard accusation of Sotos, and really just about anyone who makes art that trades in some kind of transgressive extreme material, is that it's first and foremost an attempt to shock and provoke. I would argue that this is one of, if not the primary criticism of Sotos, invariably from people who have read little to none of his work. This is, of course, a ridiculous argument. If Sotos is attempting to shock in order to drive readership, it's not working. As he said in his well-known talk at the Pompidou Center in 2012, you cannot sell fewer books than him. Sotos's work is a niche within a niche within a niche, and despite the relatively outsized name recognition he might have nowadays due to the modern internet's fascination with anything totally sick and dark, bro, he has mostly toiled in obscurity while working day jobs the entire time. Writing has never been a career for him. Furthermore, who exactly would Sotos be attempting to provoke? Reading Sotos is an entirely self-selecting endeavor. No human being on planet Earth has ever accidentally stumbled across a copy of Pure in Barnes & Noble. To accuse Sotos, whose writing career now extends through 4 decades of merely being edgy and shocking, is a tremendous misstep which is easily dismissed with a moment's thought. That being said, If there's anywhere in Sotos' career that it does make sense to level that accusation, it's absolutely at Pure and other very early material. I can't read Sotos' mind and tell you that the intent behind Pure was specifically to provoke, but it can certainly feel like it much of the time, and I would say that there's at least a kernel of truth behind the accusation in this case. Largely, I think it's a matter of a novice writer trying to find their voice. There's some pretty clumsy prose in Pure. At the time of writing, Sotos was in his early 20s and had, at least to my knowledge, never published anything before, and to call what amounts to a serial killer fanzine publishing is really stretching the definition of the word. The writing is generally stronger than, say, a punk zine from the same era, but you should consider them as being similar items structurally. What you are reading in Pure is, by definition, amateur material, the kind that would largely be lost to time and forgotten for most authors. Sotos just had the misfortune for his early awkward period to be permanently on display. It was also, by definition, not meant to be read as literature of any kind. It was a special interest zine created by and for a very specific kind of weirdo who was not in any way going to let the latent clumsiness of the presentation get in the way of enjoying the raw content within. All of these points are reinforced by the opening of Pure number 1, where Sotos presents what you might call the manifesto of the whole project. In our search for extremes, we are constantly bombarded with humanist, feminist, and other equally asinine diatribes that writers employ to alleviate the strain on their conscience, or to try and seduce us into their maudlin world of false securities and self-contempt. Pure exists, then, for those who desire extremes and are tired of listening to and or acting like house pets. Pure satiates and encourages true lusts. There is no need to convince outsiders of a philosophy, nor any reason to hide or pawn our tastes and instincts off as a moralistic examination of the dark side of human nature. There is no mission to force a begrudged acceptance of the supposed true state of the human condition. We offer no such safeties and, monetary concerns aside, new liberal and free-thinking converts are of little use. Pure exists for those who want it. I know what you're thinking, and you'd be correct. This is fucking ridiculous. Absolutely goofy, especially now, 40 years on from its writing. Totally pretentious and self-serious and obstinately spooky, a trench coat in written form. And it's immediately familiar to me, as it will likely be immediately familiar to many of you listening now, because it is nearly identical to the way guys in black metal bands would write in the late 80s and early 90s. What you are identifying is a peculiar kind of Gen Xer edginess, sure, but you're also identifying just what guys of this age who were into weird stuff in this era sounded like. And I would argue basically what guys into weird stuff in their early 20s always sound like. You might like one particular inflection of it more than another, but boiled down, this is what guys who are into what we'll call extreme art always sound like in their teens and early 20s. You may think you sound or sounded different depending on your age, but I guarantee you that you were far closer to this than you want to imagine. I still involuntarily shudder every time I remember how I thought, felt, and acted from the age of about 17 to, 2 weeks ago. So while it is frequently ridiculous and that does bring the quality of Pure down substantially, it's not really a problem unique to Sotos and also not one that extends past the earliest part of his career. It can be really funny though, so I'll point out whenever there's something really egregious. Now, earlier I raised the question of who Sotos would be trying to provoke given his audience, suggesting that the answer is that provocation isn't the intent because the audience is so self-selecting. But I'm bending the truth there. There's certainly at least a small attempt to provoke, but there's still no intended audience for the provocation. Ironically, a great number of people have ended up being provoked by it due to the media's coverage of Pure at the time of his arrest, and in years since due to the legend that has arisen around it. Pure provokes because, backwardly, it was turned into a piece of shock art as a result of it being exposed to a much larger audience than it was ever supposed to, which, in a moment of serendipity, ends up mirroring concepts that Sotos explores intensely throughout his career. But in terms of who it's meant to provoke, absent the events that made it so much more well-known than it would have been otherwise, well, that's a matter of youth and culture. Let's draw a musical comparison. There's a lot of guys in death and black metal bands who trade in provocation. Let's narrow the focus to anti-Christianity just for the purpose of discussion. These bands will crow loudly and repeatedly about their antipathy toward Yahweh, and they're probably not lying about it, but the tendency to trade in graphic blasphemy or declarations of victory over Christ rings a little hollow when it's being expressed almost exclusively to people who already agree with the broad strokes. There's an intent to offend, yes, but there's no audience to offend. No priest is accidentally stumbling across a Deathspell Omega CD and having a crisis of faith as a result. You end up with a whole lot of strident sloganeering which appears to be an aggressive and oppositional position, but is in actuality a glorified team-building exercise that offends no one in the room. For the Zoomers, think of it like this. Are the Christians in the room with us right now? If we accept this formulation as true, there needs to be an alternate explanation provided for the activity. There might be more answers, but I can identify two primary routes which apply to both the aforementioned musical genres and pure. The first is a matter of aesthetics. Death and black metal trade in ostentatious blasphemy because they are, among other things, important aesthetic markers for the styles. Your logo has an inverted cross because, well, that's just what you do, and as a fan of the style you play in, you have a fondness for those aesthetic markers regardless of whether you really believe in them or not. Sotos, likewise, is influenced by a slew of antagonistic writers of yesteryear, as well as a then-contemporary expression of counterculture which can be most simply described as punk, much as he would likely loathe to be described as such. The other framing is that the intent to offend is not actually an intent to offend, it's actually a sort of self-celebration, a cackling inside joke that is appreciated by members of the in-group, and any reaction of horror from the out-group is merely a bonus. When Typhus declares that they shit in the mouth of Christ, they're not really saying that with the intent of bothering someone who would be upset by depictions of Abrahamic coprophagia, but on the off chance a normie stumbles into one of their shows, that's certainly an additional source of amusement. And so it goes for pure, in which the bloodthirsty elitist attitude is shorthand for a sort of raucous party for weirdos which was accidentally crashed by the broader culture. This is the whole thing about pure that's largely missed by critics. For whatever art house reputation Sotos has developed over the years, Pure was a zine that was developed for a particular strain of sadistic gorehound. The intent can't be divorced from the material. For all its inherent ridiculousness, the manifesto I read earlier is a very honest and straightforward depiction of the goal of the whole endeavor. Any attempted critical deconstruction of Pure will always necessarily fail, because this isn't a scenario where death of the author can be whipped out to smooth out all its edges. Sotos made this material in the DIY tradition because it was the material he wanted but could not find. Pure is the result of Sotos' personal archives of information on the contained crimes, spanning God knows how many books, newspaper clippings, and other sources, compiled out of his own personal obsession. Artistic interpretation doesn't enter the picture because Pure is fundamentally not art, at least not in the way that we typically define it. Sotos would likely describe Pure as pornography, first and foremost. The way Sotos defines pornography is a complicated thing, and a discussion will likely return to repeatedly in the future, but for the time being, it suffices to say that, at least to Sotos, pornography is not primarily a creative endeavor. And so, within Pure, while there might be some prose to be found or some creativity located in the way he writes about the crimes within, the purpose of it is the crimes themselves, not the surrounding artistry. Sotos never intends to let himself get in the way of all the slaughter, a tendency that he decries in true crime books frequently in Parasite. It's necessary to contextualize all this within the time period that Pure was composed and distributed. Another big criticism of Pure is that it's just some particularly ugly depictions of violent crime that any teenager could do. The old Jackson Pollock is just spraying paint at random thing with more bloodshed. And this might be true today, where all of this information is far more accessible due to the internet and an overall larger media ecosystem. Such was not the case in 1984, and as such, when reading Pure, you're looking at what's actually a tremendous amount of labor in compiling this information. It was not neatly packaged on Wikipedia back then. Creating Pure necessitated a massive amount of time and effort spent compiling information, cross-referencing various accounts of the same killers, writing articles, and then typesetting and distributing the material, which also had logistical limitations in the 80s. It's only now, 40 years later, that we can hand-wave Pure as something easy to construct. Closer to its writing, it could be more easily perceived as the labor of hate that it is. From Pure number 2, in the piece Lustmord, which compiles information on the various crimes of Peter Sotos. Olive Smelt, August 15, 1975. As I walked down the street, a man came up to me face to face and said, "The weather's letting us down, isn't it?" The next thing I remember is crawling along the pavement covered in blood and shouting for help. Peter smashed the hammer onto Olive's head, and as she fell, he hit her once again. The investigating officer later said her head resembled a smashed eggshell. Peter dragged a small hacksaw across her naked back, just above the buttocks, after pulling her clothes apart. One cut was 6 inches, the other 8 inches long. Olive survived the attack, but again it made no difference as her life is ruined. She carries severe lacerations above both eyes. All I can think is that he didn't finish me off because a courting couple in a car happened to switch on their headlights. I was in hospital for weeks and I'm still not right. I have blood pressure and I suffer from depression and I have sudden feelings of antagonism towards men. For a long time I wouldn't sleep with the window open. I had this fear that he might come back. Even a short item like this necessitates a lot of work to draft back in 1984. I seriously doubt this whole account is merely pulled from a single book. I don't believe Sotos would be satisfied with information that hasn't been vetted for authenticity. So with that in mind, we have quotes from the victim, detailed information on injuries suffered, and context for the attack within Sutcliffe's greater criminal history elsewhere in the article. For a then obscure British murderer, it would have taken serious effort to compile this information, but Sotos does it again and again and again across Pure. And here's the kicker. This entry about Olive Smelt is one of 20 such entries about individual victims. Further adding to the workload is that Sotos doesn't merely cover past crimes, but provides updates on killers actively undergoing trial or in prison, necessitating not merely periodic raids on the library, but current monitoring of ongoing cases. Issues number 2 and number 3 of Pure feature large amounts of news updates on previously covered cases or other material of interest to its audience. This is not the product of a dilettante. Sotos is obsessed in a way few are, and Pure was developed for individuals with a similar level of obsession. What elevates and distinguishes Pure from any other gorehound zine from the time period, though, apart from its meanness and high level of research, is its somewhat unintentional literary quality. Pure isn't art, but it is artistic. Sotos did not, I think, plan for it to launch a writing career, to whatever extent you can describe it as such, but through all the clumsiness and contemptuous sneer you can see a style emerging, albeit in an embryonic form. In assembling these articles, a premium is placed on flow and atmosphere. It's not sufficient to Sotos that the reader be informed, but that they feel the viciousness of the crimes, and that is accomplished by turning descriptions of the crimes into narrations with a certain sense of flair. Take this passage from Speck and Heron's in Pure number 3. Heron's second murder earned him the misleading moniker of the Lipstick Killer. Before he left Frances Brown's apartment, William scrawled a message of desperation on her living room wall. "For heaven's sake, catch me before I kill more. I cannot control myself." This message, printed in lipstick, attests to the overpowering, almost crushing surge of energy in Heron's lusts. He was completely controlled by drives that he couldn't understand. William attacked Frances in much the same way that he did Josephine Ross. After surprising Frances in her apartment, William rushed her and crashed the butt of his revolver down onto her head. She screamed, and he hit her again. Blood started to gush from the open bump on Frances's head as William slammed the gun end down once again. William began to beat the woman's 33-year-old head with the now blood-spattered gun. Frances, however, never lost consciousness and kept on bleeding. William thought the shrieks were getting too loud and decided to put a quick stop to it. He turned the gun around in his palm, placed the barrel to the screaming bitch's forehead, and squeezed the trigger back. The bullet split through the lady's skull and lodged into her brain. She stopped screaming and died instantly. Did you strike her pretty hard? Heurens. She didn't keep quiet, so I must have struck her pretty lightly. She went down from the blows? Yes. Were all the blows administered with the back of the gun? Yes. What kind of gun did you have? It was a big one. Now, turning crimes into narratives is hardly a new technique. It's kind of the whole principle that true crime writing is built upon. But the difference is in execution, if you'll pardon the pun. True crime writing tends to, in terms of genre, approximate something like a thriller or mystery. There's a lot of emphasis on tension building and scene setting. Sotos, though, writes pornography. He provides the barest amount of detail necessary for you to understand the setup, and then dives immediately into the gory details. There's a real economy to the information that's provided to the reader. Anything that doesn't immediately add to the impact of the crimes themselves is excised. Sotos has essentially zero interest in the killers as people. Unlike most true crime writing, you'll notice a conspicuous absence of rumination over the childhood traumas that might have led to a killer's later actions. He doesn't care about that. He is obsessively focused on the crimes themselves and has no real intent to humanize the killers. A lot of people, when speaking of Sotos' work, describe it as particularly grueling because you're supposed to be inhabiting the mind of a killer. This is usually meant as a kind of roundabout compliment, but I disagree. This is one of the rare cases where Sotos' intent is relatively clear. When he wants you to inhabit a certain mind, he uses the first or second person perspective. What's happening in Pure, and to a large extent in the rest of Sotos' work, isn't roleplay. It's voyeurism. One could try to relate Pure's voyeurism to that of pornography, with self-insertion understood as a natural part of the media, but this is incorrect. Self-insertion isn't native to pornography, it's native to masturbating to pornography. Remember, porno involves other people having sex. You're not a part of the experience itself. Self-insertion is always something the viewer does. This might seem like an odd bit of digression, but I think it's relevant. Sotos is a writer who, in his own way, likes to remind the reader of certain boundaries. Things that we skip past thinking about as we develop a sort of epistemological shorthand for how we analyze things. Keep this in mind as we go further into Pure and other works by Sotos. Pornography, perhaps more than any other kind of media, requires an audience to fulfill its purpose. It can't do anything without you there. Also relevant to this previous reading, Sotos' weird sense of time and structure. This reading takes up 3 paragraphs. The first entails the aftermath of a crime, the second switches to the act of that crime itself, and the third between the killer and a police officer much later on. This is a pretty tame example, but it's the seed of something that will become essential to Sotos' writing very quickly in his career. Another reading, this time from Pure number 2, in a piece titled On Top. Master and slave, dominant and submissive, top and bottom. Faggots play roles. Play games and worthless fantasies. Larry Eiler and Dennis Nilsson didn't play. They lured. They were true dominants where the submission was real, where submission was forced and inflicted on the weak. True men. Real masters. The leather boy catches his eyes from across the room. He saunters cockily over. He exhibits his tight black leather outfit stretched over firm, sweaty muscles. He walks up and faces him. His eyes stare. He tries to look tough. His hand reaches and brushes his crotch. He grabs his crotch full palm. Grope. His eyes still stare straight into his face, cool, tough, and mean, and yet he offers himself to him. They walk out together. They go to his house. Leatherboy wants to be dominated. He agrees. On your knees, faggot. Notice the abrupt shift in time and space, and from an abstract depiction to a sort of fantasy of crime. Sotos isn't concerned with maintaining a narrative in an orderly manner. This kind of structural inconsistency is a big hallmark of his writing, and it gets more extreme as his career progresses. The works break down in sequences of events, perspectives, tenses. Everything becomes a mess of past, present, future, different actors appearing and disappearing seemingly at random, bizarre shifts between first, second, and third-person perspectives that only grow more aggressive and difficult as his career moves on, until these sorts of changes start happening from sentence to sentence. Frequently, multiple threads will be maintained through a section of writing, seemingly unrelated but given meaning through their juxtaposition. An internal logic clearly governs this technique. The distortion of perspective and role is deliberate. Pure isn't particularly extreme in this regard, but keep it in mind as we move forward to other works. This becomes an important aspect faster than you might think. Also worthy of note in this passage is the way Sotos slips into a kind of fantasy of Eiler or Nilsson's crimes, and the fact that it's simultaneously neither and both of those killers is also interesting. On Top discusses both of them, but this particular fantasy, which goes on for several more paragraphs culminating in murder, could apply to either or neither of them. Sotos never makes a distinction. It's dreamlike, reality collapsing into fantasy and then snapping back to reality after the story is told. Sotos doesn't use the sort of signaling phrases or signposts common to other writers to help guide the reader through the structure of a particular passage. The vagueness and disorientation is a part of the experience. Again, this will be expanded upon later in Sotos' career, where the relationship between writer, subject, and reader become hazier and more intertwined, but it's interesting to see this technique pop up in a fledgling form as early as here. I would wager, though, that in Pure, Sotos is at his most interesting when he's exploring topics outside of unusual but still sort of rote serial killer worship. Again, the curse of Pure is how it permanently painted Sotos as a writer who merely masturbated to crime scene photos, but there's actually interesting stuff within. In Pure number 3, the charmingly titled Kid Fuck is a pretty interesting take on the child pornography industry in the 80s and the potentially unforeseen consequences of the sudden expansion of laws against that material that emerged in the era. Given Sotos' arrest before this issue could be released, its inclusion seems even more ironic. But as dire a picture as these recent events paint, it is not to suggest that all is forsaken. Indeed, because of the massive crackdown on child crimes, the few goods and artifacts that do make it through the barbed wire are usually guaranteed hard-ons of a severity rarely seen. The crackdown has pushed the buyers and sellers so far underground that only the truly diligent make it through the system. As such, the sellers know the tastes of the buyers even more intimately and are willing to go the extra lengths to satisfy them. As long as everything is so very illegal, the manufacturers have been able to pull out all the stops and are no longer concerned with making their products look tasteful or sugar-coated. Instead, the newest batch of kiddie porn is excellent. Gone are the days of fresh, smiling faces undressing for daddy and mommy. Gone are the naked young boys, hands at their sides and laughing as some photographer points to his little dick. Gone are the innocuous, mutuality-inspired pictures and artisms favored by the deluded NAMBLA and pedophile information exchange types, or the fuzzy-edged statue portraits favored by the dilettante fag crowd. The buyer who ventures through the many stops and seizures and the multifarious laws, threats, and restrictions is today almost assured of getting only the finest in child humiliation and torture. Little children sucking fat dicks of men whose faces stay well out of camera range. Big, thick sex tools spurting juicy jism over tiny 18-month-old girls in close-up, or even just the spilling cock and the little girl's tender flesh and confused, bawling face. This, to me, is Sotos firing on all cylinders. A particular fascination of Sotos seems to be the idea of perverse incentives, or how systems designed to discourage a particular behavior can frequently exacerbate it. Sotos, of course, refrains from moralizing about the issues, instead drawing the reader's attention to the complex models of cause and effect which complicate regardless of intent. Here, again, we get a small peek into the sort of writer that Sotos would end up being. Not just a perverse street preacher crowing about vice triumphing over virtue, but someone who pokes and prods at morality in an interesting way. Not whether a particular act or idea is moral or not, but whether we even truly understand the moral calculus of our own actions. Sotos is a writer much less interested in the why than the how, and I believe that, broadly, he thinks that with a detailed enough understanding of the how, the why becomes self-evident. Actions don't derive from concepts. Concepts are merely the language we develop to describe patterns of action. All this being said, it's pretty clear that the material I like best in Pure is the stuff, well, the least like Pure and the most like Sotos' later work. While any individual piece in it might be kind of interesting just due to its brazen conceit, consuming issues of Pure in aggregate is an exhausting affair. A lot of this comes down to personal taste. To whatever extent I do have an interest in serial killers or violent crime, my interests are usually in the exact opposite direction of Sotos. I'm far more interested in Carl Panzram than any given child snatcher or hooker butcher. But even controlling for that, the fact that a large portion of the material here is effectively the same thing despite covering different crimes really kills the momentum of the reading experience. And again, the writing just isn't there. From Pure number 3, the opening paragraph of Kid Kill. There's not another idea under the sun that's as blatantly stupid as that of parents. Indeed, it is the grotesque idiocy of even being a mother or father that most times renders a potentially exciting crime like incest desperate and puny. But it is because of the parents' doleful relationship to their child, that pathetic, insecurity-driven sense of mindless benevolence that controls and rationalizes their entire being, that the crime of child murder, and especially child torture murder, becomes a thrilling single crime with more than just one victim. The wails of pain, confusion, and longing that replace the dog-like mutterings of cooing and coddling from these vulnerable weakling parents is an excitement well known and celebrated by child flesh fans and voyeurs alike. This is the territory that Pure treads at its worst, and it's impossible to take seriously. This contemptuous, sneering angst is something straight out of Jim Goad's work, despite predating it by several years, but Goad has a lighter touch as a writer, a sense of humor. There's a demented Valley Girl quality to Answer Me that Sotos very explicitly lacks. While his commitment to misanthropy is admirable in its own way, it's hard to believe and even harder to defend from accusations of try-hard juvenile petulance, because, well, that's what it is. I think passages like this are the things that Sotos most intensely regrets about Pure. They're clumsy and absurd, clearly a symptom of some structural weakness underlying the whole endeavor. And Pure is littered with stuff like this, deeply self-indulgent, load-bearing prose which just isn't up to the task it's given. It really proves that there is a real art to executing really extreme, transgressive material. If there's a way to deliver it badly, there clearly is a method to evaluate it beyond its potential to nauseate. With all this in mind, the good, the bad, and Sotos' own relative dislike of the material, is Pure worth reading? I think, maybe a little surprisingly, given my interest in the author, not really. At least it's not particularly worth reading to me, given that my interest in Sotos lies far more in his later work. The genuinely intriguing and thought-provoking material in Pure generally comes to finite sections of writing rather than whole articles. The ratio of signal to noise isn't great, and the material I've selected to read is largely there to elucidate points about structure rather than illustrate quality. Some of the missteps are funny on their own. Sotos' slavering over the McMartin preschool trial is particularly ridiculous years after the farce was revealed, and he seems a little chagrined about his enthusiasm in the opening interview with Goad. But even stuff like that ends up not really being enough to move the needle for me. There's a certain kind of guy out there for whom this is the best Sotos ever was. A guy who prioritizes extremity above all else, and for whom nuance and evolution is only a distraction from the point. A guy who thinks Mayhem got too wimpy after Death Crush and only likes the Merzbow tapes where Akita was just making sounds with household objects. I think I kind of admire that guy. I can't identify with him. I'm a little too flighty to embark on that kind of vision quest for absolute zero, but I admire him as the artistic equivalent of some kind of ascetic monk. Material like you find in Pure is, as I said before, self-selecting. I think I've done enough readings for you to know whether you find it interesting or not. And if you're on the fence about it, reading the issues in full is probably not going to result in you discovering some additional layer of context that makes it all worthwhile. While my selected readings were chosen to express certain details of style, they are, by and large, representative of what you'll get from the whole thing. And if I'm being frank, the rest of the material is largely more pornographic in base than my own selections. It's simply so repetitive in its vulgarity that there is really no insight to gain. If the idea of reading another several hundred paragraphs of that appeals to you, go ahead. If you're not sure, you probably shouldn't bother. I think a more interesting question is whether this is necessary reading for a Peter Sotos fan. Let's pretend for a moment that there's such a thing as a Peter Sotos fan who hasn't read Pure. Even in that case, I'm not sure how much utility it really has. Pure, and to a lesser degree, everything in Total Abuse, is so far from where the author would eventually go, it doesn't end up being very representative of the breadth of his work. The writing style on Pure is not something that Sotos ends up revisiting. The content stays extreme and transgressive, certainly, but it just ends up getting so much smarter down the line. If there's something that damns Pure, it's how general it ends up being. It works in broad strokes, trading in ideas that are inherently offensive to the masses, but not in a unique or particularly incisive manner. Where Sotos would become a scalpel, Pure is a hammer. It does damage, but wielding it doesn't take a whole lot of skill. Pure is good at upsetting people who are unprepared for it. Later books are good at upsetting people who think they are prepared, which I find much more interesting. When I first received this so many years ago, I was in my mid-20s, around the same age Sotos was when he wrote Pure. It was an immediately bracing experience. I wasn't offended by it, but it was certainly one of the most extreme things I'd ever read, and it largely lived up to my expectations of the author. A decade later, and it doesn't hold quite so much significance anymore. I've done a lot of living and read and experienced a lot more in the intervening period, and it's hard to put myself in a headspace where I can really take this seriously. But Extremity is, as I always say, a compelling target on its own. Despite what people may suggest, this isn't merely something that any pervert could make. Nothing like Pure existed before it was made, and, even more unbelievably than that, nothing has really been written like it afterward. Thanks for listening.
I guess so. Maybe, but she really doesn't like him. And they both did it. Yeah, love would be nice. Would you love me? Would you love me? Would you love me? Would you love me? As long as you keep me safe, I'll do whatever you say. If you'll keep me safe, yes. You said you'd keep me safe, and you'd love me if I was good, and you're the only one who's ever even taken the time to talk to me. I'll do what you tell me to do. Yes, I'll do anything to stop feeling so empty.